this is episode 21 of the Mini Sculpting Super Show. I'm your host, Tom Mason, and I'd like to say a special thanks to all my patrons for helping support this show and make it possible. I'd also like to encourage you to go check out my sponsor, Sculptomo Toys. They carry a really great line of high-end action figures and collectible statues from all sorts of genres and subject matters. I was just on their site, now checking out the new stuff they have, and I was super excited to see that they just started taking pre-orders on the Ghost in the Shell, the movie, with Scarlett Johansson, 1/6 scale. I guess it's technically an action figure because it's articulated. It comes with all sorts of really cool, accessories and stuff, and it just super high quality on the costuming and everything. It looks like real. It's real fabric, not just molded plastic, and you can pose it in all sorts of different ways. I got to see the movie back in March, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was very faithfully done to the original anime, and it was neat to see all that brought to light. And if you go to sculptomo.com, you can enter the promo code TMSSS17 and get 10% off your order. All right, well, now let's get into the intro to Sculpting Skeletons. Now, to begin with, when sculpting skeletons, I think it's best to start with putty. You can do skeletons with Fimo, but because of the small area that you have to work on and the nature of just there's so little to build up, it really is a lot easier to just use putty when sculpting skeletons. So that's what I'm doing with this figure. And as you'll see, I built the armature. You do that just as normal as you would any other figure. But then I've gone ahead and put on a layer of green stuff over the whole thing, kind of like you might do if you were sculpting with Fimo. But in this case, I let it completely cure. And the reason I did that was to give it a little bit more structure and rigidity to the figure. You don't have to. You can potentially just put the putty directly onto the figure and sculpt the form. But when you do that, when you have fresh putty on wire and you continue to work it, it does have the tendency to kind of wiggle off the wire, not stick and get as a good of a bond, and you can end up getting some little air bubbles. It's very minor, but it could potentially create a loose fitting for your putty, and possibly collapses if you do bulk up in a large enough area. So, as you can see here, I've gone ahead and done that. And this figure, I should say, is also larger than, it's a bird, but it's much larger in scale. It's at least the size of a human figure, if not a little bit bigger. So I had a little more room to put the putty on first. But in this case, since we're doing the whole thing in putty, even if you put this first layer of green stuff on, and then you can let it cure and then add on extra putty afterwards, you can just add on that little bit. For instance, say you're sculpting a femur. If it's got that long, straight shaft, that's the main part of the bone, but at the ends, you have these bulbous parts. And so you can just add those bulbous parts on after everything's cured to give it the sense and make it look like it's a bone. I suppose I should mention before I get too much farther in on this, what I'm sculpting with. So the green putty you see, that is Greenstuff or Kneaditite by Polymeric Systems Inc. And the gray stuff that you're seeing, that is ProCreate putty. Specifically a little mix of 50% ProCreate and 50% Aves Epoxy Sculpt. It's all self-curing putty, so no need to bake. You just mix it up, and you have probably a good hour to work with whatever you have on there. Maybe a little longer, but you need to get a lot of the major stuff done within an hour. Now, whether you start on a large area like the rib cage or the bones, it kind of doesn't matter. It's really a matter of preference. But for this figure in particular, I decided to do the rib cage first for a couple reasons. One, it's a very large area that I thought I might have to bulk up a little more. But as you can see, I was able to go in and just sculpt it right from scratch. But I also knew there was going to be lots of parts that would end up going on top of it, like some shoulder blade type of things and collarbone elements, as well as I wasn't sure, because of the pose, I wasn't sure how easily it would be able to get inside. I might have had to move arms or whatever. So I decided to just go ahead and do that to begin with, and then move on to the rest of the bones afterwards. Now, working on the rib cage here illustrates a really good point that you have to keep in mind whenever you're doing skeletons. And that is, even though the bones are very thin and there's space between them, you're making a miniature, and that'll most likely be cast if you're making it. And so you cannot have voids like, for instance, the rib cage would create. You would end up having several individual ribs wrapping around and connecting, and having an empty area inside. Now, if you're not going to cast the miniature, you're welcome to try and do that, but it's actually very difficult to sculpt something like that just suspended in thin air without creating an individual armature for each piece of rib. So what I suggest to do is bulk up the rib cage into the overall form and shape that you need it to be, and then press in the shapes using tools like a clay shaper or a small probe or other small burnishing tool. Anything you can to cut in that shape and then slowly define the ribs. As you can see here, I started off by cutting in the shape with my Scalpel or X-Acto blade, and then I widened the gap in the shape to define the ribs with the clay shaper. And then I just went over and just slowly refined things. I also added a little bit of putty after I had worked out the main shape on the front, and that's just to create a sternum. And you're gonna want to look at reference when you're sculpting a skeleton, so you know what bones go where and how you want things to look. But these are miniatures. Have fun with it. You need to make sure that it's got enough of the skeleton there that it makes sense to the viewer. But you can, fudge things, and it doesn't have to be 100% accurate unless that's what you want to go for. I'm also doing a little bit of bulking on the head, because the head or the skull of a skeleton is going to be the other part. The rib cage and the head are the two parts that have the most form with skeletons. Now that you have that first anchor point in the form of the rib cage finished, we can move on to starting to sculpt the individual bones. Now, what I like to do is I like to mix up a batch of putty and try and spread it out even amounts on the symmetrical bones. And what I mean by that is, if I'm going to work on the upper leg bones or the femur, then I will try and grab about the same amount of putty for each one and go ahead and stick that on the armature at the same time. You do that because the putty is very soft and easily malleable in the very beginning. And so you can press it on there and then just start to get them both roughly into the form. And you can move back and forth between the two parts to try and accentuate the form of the bones. And if you still have more putty left over, you can go ahead and work your way down and do another part. Move down the line onto the next bone down the leg, for instance, in this case. But the thing to keep in mind when you're doing these bones, a neat, quick little trick you can do to really get and capture the form is you want to make them a little thinner in the center part of the line, so to speak. So, a bone's essentially a line for the most of the time when you're going to be sculpting these. There's a couple parts where you'll have one span of the armature that would technically be two bones. So, for instance, on your forearm, there's actually two bones in there. But you obviously only have one piece of wire for the armature. Well, you have to put the putty down, press it into shape, form it up, but then you have to start defining, just like we did with the ribs, you have to define that as two separate bones. But in this case, and you can use this when I'm talking about to work on that part as well. But the main thing I'm talking about now is when you've got a singular bone, you want to make sure it's thinner, a little thinner in the middle of that line, and then a little larger on the ends. Obviously, look at your reference for a skeleton to see just how the bones form and bend, because they're not all stock. But a lot of times you can get away with just that little trick of having it thinner in the center and larger on the ends, and a little more rounded. Another tip, especially when you've got two bones that are meeting, is rather than making the bone very rounded, you want to actually make it a little bit flatter on one side. And that's because the bones, even though they're a little rounded, they can tend to have a bit of a flat spot where to kind of help contain the cartilage. I don't know. I feel a little weird even suggesting that, though, because you really just have to look. You're going to have to study anatomy of bones and skeletons a little bit just to get a sense. But these are just some simple little tricks that can kind of cheat your way there, if you know what I mean. But it's always good to use reference and to try and get as close as you can to a more reasonable facsimile. The spine is a really fun element to sculpt. For this, you lay down the putty very similarly to how you would with the bone. You have to get a basic form and structure going, and you want to try and make this solid shape as much in the shape as possible. So as you can see, I've done some of the spine already, and you might notice that there's these little dips and sections already formed. So what I suggest you do is, rather than trying to brute force make them, especially after cutting in the individual vertebrae, you don't want to make them all completely separate. You want to make that shape as much as possible before you even cut the vertebrae in. Then you can go back and just help redefine, accentuate a little more. But it makes it way easier to define them and get the overall shape if you have that main form set to begin with. Now I went ahead and laid in the vertebrae for this guy's tail right away, but what you'll see here, and this is another good tip whenever you're using putty, especially when you've got something that has lots of details and cutting, is I'm going to lay this in, wrap it around the armature and get it into form and into shape. But then I'm actually going to leave it, and I'm going to move off, and I'm going to start sculpting this other wing. I did one of the wings over there earlier, unrecorded, and but then you'll see me start sculpting the bones for the other wing. And I let the putty that I laid down for the neck just set up a little bit. And the reason you do that is sometimes when it's very soft and new and freshly mixed, it can be so soft that when you cut in, even with a very sharp blade, the putty can tend to want to roll into the tool you're using. So for instance, if you're pressing in or even slicing, we'll start with pressing in. So if you're pressing in with a Scalpel or an X-Acto blade, the putty will actually roll in towards the blade, and instead of having a nice, sharp, crisp line, you'll actually get a bit of a rolled edge, which sometimes you want that, but most times when you're using a really fine, sharp blade like that, you don't. You want more of a crisp edge. The other technique you can do, rather than pressing in with the blade to make the cuts, is to actually slice the putty, and that's where you, rather than just pressing in, you drag it along the putty. And it takes a very light touch, and you need to make sure your tube is well lubricated with some petroleum jelly or saliva or face grease, whatever you want to use. And that's a nice way to just get a nice crisp cut. But if the putty's too soft and fresh, it can get dragged, and that can be almost worse than pressing in, because at least when you press in, it's just rolling into the tool. When you slice, it will drag it off of the armature or in that direction, and can make the whole thing look very lopsided. As I'm working on this bone, I want to point out, I think I did it earlier, I'm not sure if we'll see it on this part, but as you're adding and bulking up these bones, don't be afraid. So right there, I'm putting on like a couple pieces at once rather than one big piece, because I knew that I wanted a little more at the ends of the bone and not so much in the middle. And by putting more of the blob towards the ends, that automatically makes it so there will be less material in the centers of the bone. And that just saves time for kind of spreading things out. You do tend to have to blend the putty in a little bit more, but it can be nice not to have to work the putty to the ends of the bones and away from that center where you need it to be a little thinner. Also, don't be afraid to go back and add a little extra putty in to the bones if they aren't fully up to shape, even if it's completely cured. Or, better yet, if you've added too much to the skeleton, then you can always trim it off with an X-Acto blade. There's one last thing I wanted to cover about sculpting, and in this intro to sculpting skeletons, and that's the fact that you need to be mindful of how thick you're making your bones. And by that, I don't mean make sure they're not too thick. I mean make sure they're not too thin. Obviously, a bone is much thinner than your leg or your arm with muscles all over it, your body with muscles all over it. And you need to keep that in mind when you're sculpting the figure, especially if it's going to be cast, because if you make it too thin, it won't cast easily, or even worse, if it does cast, it might be very fragile and can easily break. And so you need to be very mindful of that, and it's okay to over-exaggerate a little bit. Even if you can over-exaggerate the thickness of a bone and it will still seem thinner than, a human it's standing next to that is fully clothed or has all of its anatomy. And that way, if you do that, you'll make sure your skeleton is robust enough to be cast easily and supported after it's built. If you really want to be technical about it and get it more accurate, but you want more strength, then I guess the only tip I can give is make sure you have a lot of extra equipment and clothing that can be added and wrapped around to kind of fill in that gap and pick up some of that slack. Well, thank you so much for watching this intro to sculpting skeletons. Next time we'll cover some of the more intricate details, such as sculpting a skull and maybe the pelvis, some of the more tricky elements of sculpting a skeleton. Thank you for watching, and especially to everyone over on Patreon for supporting the show. And remember, keep sculpting.